In China, being the biggest fish in the pond doesn't mean you control the water. Sometimes, the smallest shrimp can stop a massive cargo ship from leaving the port. If you don't understand the power of micro games, your giant budget is just a target. The term is 绕速小序. Literally, it means small accumulation of the taming power of the small. Most Westerners think they need a 10 million and purchase order to get a factory owner's attention. They try to buy loyalty with volume. Big mistake. In the factory owner's world, 绕速小序 is about strategic friction. Think of a single pebble stopping a massive gear. It has the line manager who accidentally forgets to prioritize your QC check because you didn't acknowledge his birthday. It's the sub-supplier who holds up a 5 million and shipment for a 500 million and paid more fee. The silent code is density over volume. It is not about how much money you throw. It is about how many small threads you have tied to the key decision makers. In China, the wind is gathering dense clouds, but it hasn't rained yet. You are in the accumulation phase, where small, consistent gestures create a massive psychological debt. Master the small favor 小恩小惠, well, and Rahui. Don't wait for the annual gala. Send a specific, thoughtful gift to the shipping clerk or the lead engineer. These small clauses eventually bring the rain. Control the critical component 核心微件, if possible. Own the intellectual property of a tiny but vital part of the product. Use that 1% to ensure 100% compliance. The shadow influence. Build a relationship with the person who has the boss as his long-time driver or the personal assistant. In also, the shadow often carries more weight than the light. Stop trying to be a bulldozer. Start being the wind that shapes the claws. Follow me to master the invisible levers of Chinese manufacturing. See you in the next cycle.
So I want you to think about the largest, most intimidating ocean liner you can possibly imagine.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right? Just this massive steel leviathan cutting through the ocean. It's got, hundreds of thousands of tons of displacement and this momentum that is so overwhelming. It literally takes miles just to bring the thing to a halt.
Yeah, you can't just stop a ship like that on a dime.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now imagine you are tasked with changing the direction of that massive ship. But here's the catch. You're just floating in the water next to it.
Oh, man, good luck.
Right. You don't have a tugboat. You don't have a massive engine strapped to your back. You are just you. And if you swim up to the side of that hull and just push with all your might, relying on your own brute force to, alter its trajectory.
You're just going to exhaust yourself.
Complete. And the ship isn't even going to register your existence. I mean, it will literally crush you or just leave you in its wake. And the conventional wisdom in this scenario, which is basically the voice of absolute despair in the back of your head, it screams that you have absolutely zero leverage.
Because you don't have the mass.
Right. You don't have the mass, so you don't get a say.
Right.
But if you look at the very back of that massive ship, attached to the trailing edge of the giant main rudder, there is this tiny, almost microscopic secondary rudder. It's called a trim tab.
Which is just a brilliant piece of engineering, honestly.
Yeah.
And really, it's a perfect conceptual anchor for what we are unpacking today. Because the trim tab, it doesn't try to push the ship.
Right.
It doesn't even try to push the main rudder. It just moves like a few degrees in the opposite direction.
Exactly. Just turns slightly. And by doing that, it creates this tiny pocket of low pressure in the water. And that low pressure zone uses the ocean's own physics to effortlessly swing the massive main rudder, which in turn swings the entire hundreds of thousands of tons of the ship.
Yeah, the tiny thing doesn't fight the giant at all. It uses the giant's own environment to guide it.
Okay, let's unpack this because today we are doing a deep dive into the strategic equivalent of the trim tab. We're looking at a stack of research centered around this remarkably profound piece of source material. It's an ancient concept drawn from the Bazi-ching, or the Book of Changes. Specifically, we're focusing on Hexagram 9, and the text refers to this concept as Xiao Xu.
Right, which is commonly translated into English as small taming.
Small taming.
Yeah, and I think it's important to ground the listener immediately regarding this source text, because when people hear I Ching, They sometimes assume, we are about to dive into mysticism or divination or something.
Fortune telling,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. But if you strip away the historical mythology, what you are left with is actually one of the oldest, most rigorously observed manuals on power dynamics, organizational behavior, and really just the physics of human relationships ever recorded.
It's pure strategy.
It is. It's a study of how complex systems interact under pressure.
And the mission of our deep dive today is to take the mechanics of Xiao Xu, and apply them directly to the modern cutthroat environments you navigate every single day. We're going to look at how a tiny, seemingly powerless entity, like, a solitary employee, an independent contractor, maybe a boutique agency or a guerrilla startup, how that entity can effectively restrain, influence, and completely redirect a massive monolithic organization.
Because we all face those giants.
We do. If you are sitting across the table right now from an impossibly rigid boss or a sprawling corporate bureaucracy or an entire industry structure that just feels impenetrable, you are the small entity. You are facing Goliath. So we are going to explore a highly actionable blueprint for asymmetrical influence. We are going to figure out how to be the trim tab.
And to do that, the central conflict we really need to dissect right out of the gate is this battle between two vastly different mental models of negotiation.
Okay, set the stage for us.
So, on one side, you have the mindset of the corporate giant. This is that deeply ingrained belief that scale, capital, and brute force are the only valid forms of leverage.
The big checkbook.
Right. And on the other side, you have the mindset of what we might call the guerrilla negotiator, who operates on the principles of small leverage. And what's fascinating is the text really attacks the core premise of modern capitalism here. It attacks the assumption that the person with the biggest checkbook inevitably dictates the terms of reality.
Let's test that assumption, though, because, it feels undeniably true to anyone who has ever lost a bid to a massive competitor.
Oh, absolutely, it feels true.
Like, if I am a boutique buyer, right, and I'm trying to secure manufacturing time at a massive mega factory, and I can only order, say, 10,000 units, and my competitor walks in and orders 10 million units. The baseline assumption is that I am getting pushed straight to the back of the line.
Of course.
The checkbook wins. Volume dictates value. So why does the source text argue that this is basically an illusion?
It's an illusion because it assumes a completely friction-free vacuum. Like in a theoretical spreadsheet, sure, 10 million units is obviously better than 10,000.
The math checks out.
The math checks out. But large organizations, mega factories, vast corporate bureaucracies, they do not exist on spreadsheets. They exist in the physical world, which is entirely composed of friction. So to a mega factory, a massive checkbook is certainly enticing, obviously, but it also brings a catastrophic amount of operational stress.
Right, because it's not just like magical money appearing in a bank account. It's a massive physical undertaking.
It is a logistical nightmare. It requires retooling assembly lines, it strains supply chains, it demands massive overtime from exhausted floor managers, and it involves taking on immense quality control risks.
So the corporate giant representing the massive order, they walk into the negotiation thinking they're Santa Claus.
Yes, they're like, I am giving you $50 million, therefore you will bend to my will, prioritize my schedule, and accept all my demands.
They're just throwing their mass around to create compliance.
Exactly. But internally, the factory views them as a profoundly heavy, cumbersome burden that just happens to pay well. The relationship is entirely transactional, it's completely devoid of loyalty, and it's basically constantly teetering on the edge of resentment.
I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the factory management in that scenario. Like, if I'm running a facility that's already running at 95% capacity and someone comes in demanding I fulfill a massive new order by screaming about how much money they're spending, my primary emotion isn't gratitude.
No, it's panic.
It's survival anxiety. I'm looking at this giant client as a literal threat to my operational stability, even if they're boosting my quarterly revenue.
And that reality creates a massive vulnerability in the giant's armor. And this is exactly where the text introduces the pivotal concept that flips the script. In the original Chinese, the term is tichun.
Tichun.
Yeah, which translates to refinement.
Refinement. Okay, let's really drill into the mechanics of that because it sounds a bit abstract. What does refinement actually mean in this context?
Well, refinement is basically the ultimate weapon of the guerrilla negotiator. The idea is that true leverage, the kind that actually compels a massive entity to alter its behavior in your favor, it does not come from trying to match their volume.
Because you can't.
Right, you're the small entity. Instead, it comes from achieving an intimate, almost microscopic understanding of the giant's internal pain points. So, Think of the big checkbook as loud leverage. It demands. Refinement, on the other hand, is quiet leverage. It understands.
Oh, I like that. So if we go back to the ship analogy for a second, the giant checkbook is like someone trying to bolt a massive extra engine onto the back of the ship while it's moving, just yelling at the crew to battle faster.
Yeah, exactly.
But refinement is the engineer who quietly studies the schematics, realizes the rudder is jammed because of a tiny buildup of rust on a single hinge, and just applies a single drop of highly specialized solvent.
That is a perfect way to look at it. The loud approach adds mass and stress. The quiet approach removes friction.
Adds mass versus removes friction. That's huge.
The distinction between the two is everything. The text urges the small entity to engage in this active process of teach-in, this refinement. So instead of walking into the factory and apologizing for your small order, or, trying to puff yourself up to look bigger than you actually are.
Which never works, by the way.
It never works. They see right through it. Instead of doing that, you study the environment. You analyze the overlapping systems. You ask yourself, what is currently bottlenecking their shipping department? What specific material shortage is causing their supply chain manager to lose sleep right now? What minor compliance issue is threatening their margins?
And the beauty of being small is that you actually have the agility to look for those things. Because the massive client with the 10 million unit order, they are entirely blinded by their own arrogance.
Completely blinded.
They're so obsessed with their own scale that they don't care about the factory's pain points. They expect the factory to absorb the pain for them.
Exactly, but the small entity, the boutique operator, has the maneuverability to crawl through the internal machinery and map those friction points. And the irony here is that massive organizations are fundamentally fragile.
Really? Even the mega factories?
Oh, especially them. A megafactory or a sprawling corporate division is basically just a precarious collection of overlapping bottlenecks. And when you, as the small entity, deploy refinement to identify and lubricate just one of those critical bottlenecks, your strategic value instantly supersedes your physical size.
Oh.
You are no longer evaluated by the volume of your transaction. You are evaluated by the systemic relief you provide.
You transition from being a noisy, annoying customer to being a vital component of their operational health.
Precisely.
I want to pause here because the implication for the listener is profound. Think about a relationship right now in your own life where you feel completely outgunned. It could be, trying to get a major software provider to customize a feature for your small business, or trying to convince a massive multi-departmental committee to approve your standalone project.
We've all been there.
The default human instinct is to try and swing a sledgehammer. We walk into the room with our PowerPoint deck and we just list our demands. We say, my project is important, look at my metrics, I need this budget, you have to prioritize me. We basically try to simulate mass.
And we inevitably fail. Because the giant is literally designed to absorb and deflect brute force. A corporate committee is a fortress built to withstand demands.
So the pivot is to stop talking about yourself entirely. Stop presenting your own needs. You have to undergo this radical ego shift where you become utterly obsessed with their internal friction. You have to find their rust.
But the challenge, however, is that identifying the friction point, possessing that refinement, that is only the first step. Because the text then forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality about the timing of influence.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Having the solvent for the rust doesn't mean the ship turns the exact moment you apply it. There's a temporal gap between the execution of the small leverage and the realization of the massive result.
And this brings us to what is arguably the emotional core of this entire source text. It introduces this central, recurring meteorological metaphor that just perfectly captures the psychological agony of the strategy.
Its agony is very real.
The text describes the state of Xiao Xu with a very specific, evocative phrase. It says, dense clouds gather, but no rain falls.
Dense clouds gather, but no rain falls. It is just a brilliant encapsulation of a very specific type of structural frustration.
I want to really sit with that image for a second, because if you've ever lived somewhere with intense summer weather, you know exactly what this feels like on a visceral level.
Oh yeah, the humidity.
Right. It's like a late afternoon in August. The sky turns this bruised, heavy purple. The barometric pressure drops so fast you can literally feel it in your jaw. The air is incredibly thick, humid, and completely still. All of the physical conditions for a massive cathartic thunderstorm are present.
The potential energy is just hanging there.
It's overwhelming. But nothing happens. You just stand there, sweating, uncomfortable, waiting for the release, waiting for the sky to break open, and it just hangs there. It is the agonizing suspension of high potential with zero realization.
And if we map that meteorological phenomenon strictly onto the mechanics of strategic influence, the translation is striking. The clouds, in this metaphor, represent your active preparation. They are the accumulation of your refinement.
Okay, so the clouds are the work you're putting in.
Right. You've mapped the giant's pain points. You've positioned yourself as useful. You are quietly applying the solvent to the rust. You are building the relationship. That is the accumulation of potential energy.
Gathering of the clouds.
Exactly. And the rain in the text vocabulary represents the result or the resolution. It is the signed contract, the promotion, the sudden paradigm shift where the giant finally yields to your influence and gives you what you need.
Which means being in the Xiao Xu stage, practicing small taming, means you are intentionally living in that agonizing, humid, pre-storm environment. You are doing all the right things, the sky is dark with your potential, but you haven't secured the payoff yet.
And that's exactly where people break.
Well, my immediate reaction to that, and I'm sure it's the listener's reaction too, is that this sounds like a recipe for getting completely taken advantage of. Like, how do you know you aren't just doing free work for a giant who is never going to let the rain fall?
That's the core fear, right? But the distinction lies in understanding the difference between passive hope and active accumulation. The text does not say wait for the clouds to gather. It says dense clouds gather. Gathering is a verb.
It's an active process.
It is a highly deliberate strategic process. The psychology of the Xiao Xu stage requires an almost superhuman level of emotional discipline. Because when you are the small entity, you lack the mass to simply squeeze the clouds and force the rain. You cannot command a thunderstorm. What you can do, though, is actively engineer the atmospheric pressure.
Okay, let's ground that. What does engineering the atmospheric pressure actually look like in a real-world negotiation?
It looks like continuously feeding the system without issuing an ultimatum. It means consistently demonstrating your refinement. So, you solve a tiny supply chain issue for them on Tuesday. You offer a micro insight about their competitor on Friday. You introduce them to a vetted contractor the following week.
You're just constantly being useful.
Yes, you are methodically building an indispensable web of reliance. Now, to an outside observer, or frankly to your own impatient boss, it might look like nothing is happening because the final contract hasn't been signed, the rain hasn't fallen.
Right.
But if your refinement is accurate, the giant's dependence on your specific expertise is measurably increasing with every interaction. You are winding a massive coil spring.
Winding a spring is a great way to visualize it. From the outside, the spring looks completely static. It's just sitting there.
Yeah.
But internally, the kinetic energy is multiplying with every turn. But here is where I have to play devil's advocate, because I am looking at this through the lens of modern business culture. We operate in a hyper-fast-paced, instantly gratified, quarterly earnings-driven reality.
Speed is everything today.
Speed is treated as the ultimate virtue. If I go to my CEO and say, hey, I haven't closed the massive factory deal yet, but I am actively engineering the barometric pressure of the relationship and the clouds are gathering, I'm going to get fired.
You'd be left out of the boardroom.
Literally. How on earth do you justify this waiting period?
Well, you justify it by understanding the catastrophic alternative, which the text explicitly warns against. The text notes the single greatest vulnerability of the small entity is not its lack of size, but its lack of patience. The warning is stark here. If you push too hard too early, the clouds disperse.
Dispersing the clouds. What does that failure state look like in practice?
So imagine you have spent 3 months perfectly executing the Xiao Xu strategy. You've identified the factory's pain points. You've positioned your boutique firm as highly insightful. The factory management is taking your calls. They are starting to trust you. The atmospheric pressure is immense.
The clouds are dark.
The clouds are dark. But the pressure from your own CEO becomes unbearable. You panic. You decide you need to force the result. So you suddenly abandon the guerrilla negotiator mindset and try to cosplay as the corporate giant. You issue an ultimatum. You send an email saying, we have provided immense value over the last quarter. We need a commitment on our 10,000 unit order by Friday, or we are taking our business elsewhere.
You demand the rain.
Exactly. You demand the rent. And the moment you do that, you destroy the low pressure zone.
Oh.
You reveal that your refinement wasn't genuine insight. It was just a transactional trick. You prove that you are just as loud, needy, and demanding as the massive clients they already hate, except you are infinitely smaller and therefore easier to swat away.
Right, because you don't even have the big checkbook to back up the demands.
The giant looks at your tiny ultimatum, realizes you are trying to deploy a brute force lever you do not actually possess, and they simply cut communication. The clouds disperse. The sky clears. The opportunity evaporates entirely, not because your strategy was wrong, but because you lacked the psychological fortitude to hold the tension.
That is terrifying, honestly, because the temptation to force the close is so ingrained in us. Like, we're taught to always be closing, right? That's the mantra.
Always be closing.
But this text argues that always be closing is a sledgehammer tactic that only works if you already have the mass to back it up. If you are small, always be closing. Just annoys the giant.
And the guerrilla negotiator understands that holding the tension is the leverage. You have to trust the physics of the metaphor here. A pressure system cannot build indefinitely without eventually seeking equilibrium.
It has to break eventually.
It has to break. If you have genuinely identified a critical bottleneck, and you have proven yourself to be the only person holding the lockpick, the system will eventually break in your favor. The giant will be forced by its own internal machinery to open the door. But you must let them come to that realization on their own timeline.
Which perfectly transitions us from the psychological theory into the concrete reality of how this is actually executed.
Right.
Because the source material doesn't just leave us in the clouds. It provides a highly specific, brilliantly executed, real-world case study of the bottleneck strategy in action.
Yes.
This is where we see the guerrilla negotiator actually turn the trim tab.
And this case study is vital because it proves that this isn't just passive appeasement. It is a surgical strike on a giant's vulnerability.
Okay, let's lay out the board. We have a small startup. They are the epitome of the Xiao Xu underdog. They have a brilliant product design, but they need it manufactured at a world-class level. So they approach a massive $500 million mega factory.
A true Leviathan.
The problem: the startup's projected order volume is a rounding error. It's perhaps 0.1% of what the factory normally produces. If they walk in and demand priority based on their budget, they won't even get past the receptionist.
Right. They possess zero traditional leverage. The big checkbook is completely absent.
So they deploy teach-in, they deploy refinement, they spend weeks studying the factory's operations from the outside. And what they discover is honestly mind-blowing. This $500 million manufacturing Leviathan is currently bleeding cash and missing deadlines because of a highly specific, minor technical bottleneck on their assembly line.
And here is the genius part.
Yes, the bottleneck has absolutely nothing to do with the startup's product.
This detail is the crux of the entire operation.
The factory is struggling to fulfill a massive high-priority order for one of their big checkbook clients because of a calibration glitch in a specific routing machine. The giant is basically stumbling over a pebble. And the startup's engineers look at the problem and realize, because they are agile and highly specialized, that they know exactly how to rewrite the calibration software to fix the glitch.
So now, analyze the tactical crossroad the startup is at, because the amateur move, the brute force instinct, would be to march into the factory manager's office and propose a hostage trade.
Right. We have the fix. Give us what we want.
Exactly. We see you are failing at this big contract. We know how to fix it. We will give you the fix, but only if you sign a contract guaranteeing our production run first.
Which immediately triggers the giant's immune system. If I'm the factory manager and a tiny startup tries to blackmail me with a software patch, I'm going to throw them out of the building on principle.
Oh, without hesitation.
It bruises my ego, it highlights my team's incompetence, and just feels like extortion.
Precisely. It disperses the clouds instantly. And this is where the source material introduces the concept of gentle persuasion, or in Chinese, Rujingkongzi.
Rujingkongzi. Soft power.
Soft power. The guerrilla negotiator does not threaten, and they do not explicitly trade. They apply the solvent to the rust without asking for applause.
So how does the startup execute this? They don't just, email a zip file of code and say, "You're welcome."
No, the execution requires immense tactical empathy. The startup's lead engineer approached the factory's floor managers not as a savior, but as a curious peer. They utilized soft power. The conversation was framed around shared curiosity. They basically said, hey, we were looking at the routing tolerances for our own upcoming, albeit small, project, and we noticed a quirk in how the software handles this specific angle. We ran a simulation, and it seems like tweaking this line of code smooths it out. Have you guys run into anything similar with your larger runs?
Oh, man. That is incredibly smooth. They don't accuse the factory of failing.
Not at all.
They don't highlight the giant's incompetence. They frame the solution as a collaborative discovery. They allow the giant to save face while simultaneously handing them the exact key to their most agonizing bottleneck.
They solved a multi-million-dollar friction point for a completely different client's project, and they did it while acting like it was just a casual observation. Look at the psychological impact of this action. They proved, undeniably, that their technical refinement was superior to the factory's own engineering team, but they did it without triggering any defensive egos.
That's the soft power.
Yes, they entirely disarmed the factory's usual posture against small, annoying clients.
They stopped being a mosquito buzzing around the elephant's ear, and they became the symbiotic bird that cleans the elephant's teeth. They became essential.
They massively accelerated the atmospheric pressure. They gathered the densest, darkest clouds of gratitude and reliance imaginable, and they did it without ever once mentioning their own tiny production run.
Wow. They held attention.
They held the tension. They let the giant sit with the realization of the immense value that had just been provided for free.
And the ROI on this, like the moment the rain finally falls, is what makes this entire philosophy so incredibly powerful. The text reveals the aftermath of this interaction. Because of this one surgically precise act of small taming, the factory didn't just agree to manufacture the startup's tiny order.
It went way beyond that.
It did. They completely reorganized their internal hierarchy of importance. The mega factory granted this tiny startup top-tier VIP priority status for 5 solid years.
Let's dissect the economics of that resolution because it perfectly illustrates the gravity of the small. Why did the giant give them 5 years of VIP status instead of just writing them a, $100,000 consulting check for the software fix?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Because if the factory just bought the solution outright, the relationship remains transactional. The giant maintains dominance.
Exactly. But the giant didn't want a transaction. They realized they needed the startup's ongoing intellectual agility. A massive machine like that factory knows it will encounter 100 more bottlenecks over the next 5 years.
Right. The friction never ends.
Exactly. So by granting the startup VIP status, the factory was essentially integrating the startup into its own central nervous system. It cost the factory virtually nothing in hard cash to move a tiny order to the front of the line. The physical cost to the giant is negligible, but the value of that VIP status to the startup is incalculable.
It guarantees their survival.
It is the ultimate asymmetrical trade.
The trim tab turned the ship. The tiny startup, using zero brute force, zero capital leverage, and zero demands, manipulated the environment to make the giant want to serve them. The factory's massive self-interest was completely realigned to protect the startup.
It is the pinnacle of the source materials thesis. You do not conquer the giant. You gently, inevitably, make yourself the drop of oil that allows the giant's gears to turn. And once you are that drop of oil, the machine cannot function without you, and your physical size becomes entirely irrelevant.
This is a total paradigm shift for anyone listening who feels outgunned in their professional life. We spend so much time lamenting our lack of scale. We think, if only I had a bigger budget, if only I had more employees, if only I had a fancier title, then my boss would listen, then this client would respect me. We are desperately trying to forge a sledgehammer out of thin air.
And this text demands that you abandon that futile effort.
Yeah.
The sledgehammer is an illusion.
Right, so let's synthesize this blueprint into a direct, actionable mandate for you, the listener. Step 1 is confronting the reality of your situation. Look at the landscape of your career right now. Identify the mega factory. Identify the giant.
It could be anyone, really.
It might be your VP who refuses to approve your initiatives. It might be a massive vendor you rely on who treats you like a rounding error. It might be a bureaucratic compliance department that is choking your project to death. Once you identify the giant, you must consciously put down the sledgehammer. Stop asking how you can force them to give you what you want.
Stop sending the emails demanding priority. Stop pointing to your past achievements as a justification for future compliance.
Step 2. Deploy teach-in. Deploy refinement. Shift your ego entirely. Start mapping their internal machinery. Hunt for their bottleneck. What is the hyper-specific, annoying, persistent friction point that is ruining their week? What is the glitch that they are too big, too slow, or too arrogant to fix themselves? You have to become a student of their pain.
And step 3 is the execution of gentle persuasion, which requires mastering the agony of the Xiao Xu stage. You must craft the lockpick, the specific solution to their bottleneck, and you must insert it without demanding immediate compensation.
You have to let the dense clouds gather.
You have to solve their problem, offer the insight, make their life measurably easier, and then have the terrifying iron-willed discipline to just sit there in the humidity. You build the atmospheric pressure. You let them realize that you are the drop of oil they desperately need. You wait for the giant's own internal mechanics to force them to open the door.
It is a profound, incredibly demanding way to operate in the world. But before we conclude this deep dive, there is an avenue for speculation built into this source material that I think we really must explore. It's a lingering, almost philosophical problem that arises only after you successfully execute this strategy.
Ah, yes, the aftermath of the storm.
The aftermath of the storm.
Precisely. We've spent the entire hour analyzing the physics of holding back, the power of building tension, the virtue of the unreleased potential. The promise of small taming is that your strategic refinement allows the pressure to reach a critical tipping point. The clouds darken, the tension peaks, and eventually, inevitably, the rain falls. And as we saw with the startup, when that accumulated rain finally falls, it can result in a massive landscape-altering payoff. 5 years of VIP status from a single heavily leveraged action.
The floodgates open. You get exactly what you engineered.
But consider the actual physics of a deeply accumulated pressure system breaking. A gentle daily rain nourishes a landscape. But a massive artificially stalled pressure system that finally breaks all at once, that causes a flash flood. It permanently alters the topography.
That's true.
If the small entity successfully tames the great, and the giant bends its vast machinery entirely to accommodate the small, what happens to the identity of the small entity?
Oh, wow. I see where you're going with this.
If you successfully integrate yourself into the giant central nervous system and you become the vital drop of oil controlling the $500 million machine, do you eventually cease to be the guerrilla negotiator? By successfully taming the giant, does the small entity inevitably become the great?
That completely flips the board. If I use my agility and refinement to gain massive leverage, and suddenly I am dictating terms to the megafactory, I am no longer the trim tab. I have essentially taken the wheel of the ship.
And if you become the new center of gravity in that relationship, the entire strategy we just discussed becomes obsolete. You are no longer the underdog holding the tension. You are now the giant managing the scale.
Oh, man.
And historically, the moment the small becomes the great, they instantly forget the power of refinement. They pick up the sledgehammer. They become the clumsy, arrogant behemoth they originally outsmarted.
They become the vault door that some new, hungry, small entity is currently studying how to pick. That is an incredibly provocative final thought to leave you with. Small taming is the most powerful tool you have to move up the hierarchy. But the very act of successfully executing it might eventually destroy the agility that made you powerful in the first place. You are left to ponder the ultimate consequences of your own accumulating leverage. Because once those dense, carefully gathered clouds finally break, the landscape is never the same.